At 3 a.m., a man who would one day run a continent lay awake in a London room, staring at the ceiling as if it were a battlefield map. Outside, the city was blacked out, the air heavy with the threat of bombs. Inside, the threat was quieter and sharper. Time. He had already watched an empire bleed, watched friends vanish into mud, watched his own future narrow to a single question. Would he be the kind of man history remembers, or the kind it uses up and forgets? Stanley Melbourne Bruce was born on 15 April 1883 in Melbourne, into a world that looked stable from the outside and was already shifting underneath. His father, John Bruce, had come from Scotland and built a fortune in commerce. His mother, Mary Henderson, carried the discipline and expectations of a family that believed success was not a gift, but a duty. The boy grew up surrounded by the confidence of late Victorian prosperity. Big houses, polished manners, the sense that the British world was one long, unbroken corridor from Melbourne to London. But even in that comfort, there was pressure. The unspoken rule that a Bruce did not drift. A Bruce achieved. He was educated at Melbourne Grammar School, where the rituals of empire were drilled into boys like muscle memory, loyalty, restraint. As leadership, the idea that public life was the highest calling. Bruce was not the loudest presence, not the boy who won every room by force of charm. He was something more dangerous in the long run, methodical, ambitious, and capable of turning emotion into fuel. He learned to speak with control, to listen for weakness, to treat problems as systems that could be redesigned. Even as a teenager, he was absorbing a lesson that would define him. If you want to change outcomes, you don't argue with the world, you reorganize it. At the turn of the century, the gravitational pull of Britain was irresistible to families like his. Bruce went to Trinity Hall, Cambridge, to study law. Imagine the scene. A young Australian in the old stone corridors, surrounded by accents that carried centuries of certainty. Cambridge was not just an education, it was an initiation into the machinery of the British establishment. He learned how power spoke when it didn't need to shout. He learned the value of networks, dinners, clubs, quiet introductions that could open doors years later. And he learned something else, something colder. In the imperial world, Australia was admired, but it was still expected to follow. He was called to the bar at the Inner Temple, stepping into the legal profession with the credentials of the metropole. Yet the law for Bruce was never only about courtrooms. It was about structure, how rules could bind people, how institutions could be made to move. He was building a toolkit, not a career. Then history slammed the door. In 1914, Europe ignited. The Great War did not arrive as an abstract headline. It arrived as a moral demand. For men of Bruce's class and education, the war was framed as obligation, service to king and empire, proof of character. Bruce enlisted in the British Army and became an officer in the Royal Fusiliers. The decision was not unusual for his circle, but what followed would carve him into a different person. The Western Front was a factory of terror, trenches that stank of rot and cordite, the ground trembling under artillery, the sky stitched with shells. Men reduced to numbers, then to names on lists, then to silence. Bruce was wounded, badly. In 1917, he was hit and suffered severe injuries that would stay with him. This was not the romantic war of speeches and flags. It was the war of shattered bodies and amputated futures. He was sent back from the front, and the war that had promised glory delivered instead a brutal clarity. Life could be cut short without warning, and the world did not pause to apologize. That injury became his clock. Not a literal countdown, but a constant reminder that time was not infinite, that strength could vanish, that the body could betray the will. It also gave him something else, an authority that could not be faked. In the years ahead, when he spoke about national effort, sacrifice, discipline, he was not borrowing those words from propaganda. He had paid for them in blood. During the war years, another thread of his life tightened into place. In 1916, he married Ethel Dunlop Anderson. She was intelligent, socially adept, and connected, qualities that mattered in a world where politics and influence often moved through drawing rooms as much as through parliaments. Their marriage was a partnership that would steady him, and in time, it would also amplify him. Bruce was not a man who performed warmth easily in public. Ethel could soften edges, open doors, make alliances feel natural rather than transactional. When the war ended, the world Bruce returned to was not the one he had left. The old confidence had cracked. Economies were strained, societies restless, and the idea of empire, still powerful, was beginning to face questions it had never had to answer. Australia, too, was changing. It had federated only in 1901. It was still defining what kind of nation it wanted to be. The war had accelerated everything: expectations of government, demands from workers, the sense that the state could no longer pretend to be a distant referee. It had to act. Bruce came back to Australia with a resume that carried weight: Cambridge, the bar, war service, wounds. He entered business, working with the family firm, and quickly moved into the circles where economic power and political influence overlapped. He was not a populist. He did not speak the language of the street. He spoke the language of boards, budgets, and policy. But Australia in the early 1920s was a country where those languages were colliding, where the labor movement was organized and hungry, and where conservatives feared upheaval, where returned soldiers wanted stability and opportunity, and where the economy needed direction. The political arena he stepped into was already tense. The Nationalist Party, formed during the war years, represented a coalition of anti-labor forces and carried the scars of conscription, battles, and social division. The Australian Labor Party was strong, rooted in unions, and increasingly seen by its opponents as a threat to order and investment. Between them stood a new force, the Country Party, representing rural interests and determined not to be treated as a junior partner. This was not a simple two-team game. It was a knife fight in a crowded room. Bruce entered federal politics in 1918, winning the seat of Flinders in a by-election. He was only 35. In another era, he might have been told to wait his turn, to spend years as a backbencher learning the slow rituals of Parliament. But Bruce did not arrive to wait. He arrived with the impatience of a man who had seen how quickly life could be erased. In the House of Representatives, he presented himself with a controlled intensity, polite, precise, and quietly relentless. He was not the kind of speaker who set the chamber on fire with rhetoric. He was the kind who made people uneasy because he sounded like he had already done the calculations. He understood that modern politics was becoming less about grand speeches and more about administration. Tariffs, budgets, industrial relations, migration, development. The nation was a machine, and Bruce wanted to be the engineer. His rise was swift. In 1921, he was appointed treasurer in the government of Prime Minister Billy Hughes. It was a brutal portfolio for a young man. Australia carried heavy war debts, the economy was volatile, and the public expected both: prosperity and restraint, two demands that rarely coexist. As treasurer, Bruce pushed for financial orthodoxy and efficiency, believing that national strength depended on disciplined management. He was already showing the instincts that would define his leadership: a preference for planning over improvisation, for long-term national projects over short-term applause. But the real drama was not only in budgets, it was in the shifting balance of power. Billy Hughes, the little digger, was a political survivor with a talent for conflict and a taste for control. He had dominated Australian politics through war and crisis, but by the early 1920s, his grip was weakening. The Country Party, led by Earl Page, held the balance of power and was tired of being treated as an accessory. They wanted influence, not gratitude. They wanted policy, not promises. Bruce watched this with the calm of a strategist. He was not the loudest man in the room, but he could see the room's geometry. Who needed whom? Who could be isolated? Who could be replaced? He also understood something that many politicians learned too late. In a coalition, your ally can be more dangerous than your enemy, because your ally can destroy you from the inside. The 1922 federal election delivered a result that turned politics into a high-stakes negotiation. The Nationalists could not govern alone. They needed the Country Party, and the Country Party made its demand with the bluntness of a farmer laying down terms. They would not serve under Billy Hughes. Hughes, the war leader, the man who had bent the nation around his will, was suddenly facing a simple, humiliating reality. Without the Country Party, he could not stay prime minister. Here is the moment where Bruce's story stops being a biography and becomes a thriller. Behind closed doors, the future of the government was being decided not by voters, but by leverage. The Country Party held the knife. The Nationalists had to choose: cling to Hughes and fall, or sacrifice him and survive. Bruce, still in his 30s, was emerging as the acceptable alternative. Respectable, competent, not personally hated by the Country Party, and young enough to represent a new chapter. Hughes fought, of course. He had not survived decades of politics by stepping aside gracefully. But the numbers were merciless. The Country Party's condition was non-negotiable. And so, in early 1923, the Nationalist Party turned on its own leader. Hughes resigned. The old warhorse was pushed out not by an election landslide, but by the cold arithmetic of coalition power. Bruce was chosen to replace him. Think about the speed of it. A Melbourne boy shaped by privilege and expectation, refined in Cambridge halls, broken and remade in the trenches, back home barely a few years, then suddenly standing at the edge of the highest office in the land. He had not built a mass movement. He had not toured the country as a beloved tribune. He had climbed through competence, connections, and timing, through the ability to be the man others could agree on when they could agree on no one else. But the agreement came with a price. The Country Party would join the government, but they would not be silent partners. Earl Page demanded and received the position of treasurer. It was an extraordinary arrangement, the new prime minister giving the nation's finances to the leader of his coalition partner. It was not just a compromise, it was a warning. Bruce would lead, but he would be watched. Every major decision would be a negotiation. Every reform would be a battle not only against the opposition, but within his own government. And hovering over all of it was Bruce's private deadline. The knowledge lodged in his injured body and sharpened by war, that time, could turn on him without notice. He was stepping into power with a nation to build, a coalition to manage, and a political landscape that could collapse if he misjudged a single move. In 1923, as he prepared to take the prime ministership, Australia was not asking for poetry. It was asking for direction. The country wanted development, stability, and a sense that the sacrifices of war would be repaid with progress. Bruce believed he could deliver that, through planning, through investment, through a modernizing state that worked like a disciplined enterprise. But the forces gathering around him were not gentle. Organized labor was wary of conservative governments and ready to fight. Rural Australia demanded attention and money. Business wanted growth without disruption. Britain expected loyalty and alignment. And inside the coalition, Page was not a subordinate. He was a rival with a veto. Bruce was about to discover that becoming prime minister is not the moment you win the story. It's the moment the story starts hunting you. The oath is barely spoken before the trap snaps shut. Stanley Bruce becomes Prime Minister of Australia in 1923, and within hours the reality is clear. He hasn't taken the top job. He's taken the top risk. The country is hungry for growth. The world is wobbling after war, and his own government is a stitched-together coalition that can tear apart with one wrong pull. And there's a private pressure he never says out loud. The war injury that still lives in his body like a silent metronome, reminding him that strength can vanish overnight. He doesn't have the luxury of a slow apprenticeship. He has to build a nation fast or be crushed fast. He is only 39, young enough to look like the future, old enough, because of the trenches, to carry himself like a man who has already seen the end of things. The newspapers call him efficient, businesslike, modern. His supporters see a manager who can turn Australia into a machine that produces prosperity. His critics see something colder, a prime minister who speaks in plans and figures, who seems to trust systems more than crowds. And then comes the first twist that defines his rule. The man holding the nation's purse is not him. It's Earl Page, leader of the Country Party, now treasurer by coalition agreement. In most governments, the treasurer is the prime minister's instrument. In Bruce's government, the treasurer is also his coalition partner, his watchdog, and, if the moment comes, his executioner. Page represents rural Australia, farmers and graziers who believe the cities have been feeding off them for decades. He is brilliant, stubborn, and perfectly willing to bring the whole government down if he thinks the bush is being cheated. Bruce, the urbane Cambridge-trained lawyer, must now govern with a man who measures politics in wheat prices and railway miles. The opposition is waiting too. The Australian Labor Party watches this new prime minister with suspicion. To Labor, Bruce looks like the embodiment of the establishment, the kind of man who would balance budgets on the backs of workers. Unions are organized, militant, and ready. The memory of wartime conscription fights still burns in the political bloodstream. Australia is not a calm country in the 1920s. It's a country with its fists half raised, daring the government to swing first. Bruce decides he won't play defense. He will go on offense, big, visible, irreversible. His vision is blunt in its ambition. Men, money, and markets. Supply, more people through migration, more capital through borrowing and investment, more export markets tied tightly to Britain. He wants to modernize Australia like a company modernizes a factory. Standardize, expand, connect, electrify. He believes the nation's future is not in small fixes, but in national development. Roads, ports, railways, power, industry, and a stronger federal government capable of coordinating it all. But Australia's constitution is a cage built from suspicion. The states guard their powers like jealous kingdoms. The Commonwealth can't simply command, it must bargain, cajole, and sometimes bribe. Bruce's instinct is to centralize, to coordinate, to make the federal government the engine room. That instinct immediately creates enemies, not only in labor, but among state premiers who don't want Canberra telling them how to run their railways, their schools, their finances. So Bruce does something that looks technical, but is actually a power move. He pushes for new machinery to manage national and state finances. In 1923, the same year he takes office, the Loan Council is established, an arrangement to coordinate government borrowing. On paper, it's about efficiency and discipline. In practice, it's about control. Who gets to borrow, how much, and for what? Borrowing is the lifeblood of development, and Bruce wants that lifeblood flowing through a system he can influence. He also moves to reshape Australia's relationship with Britain. Bruce is not a nationalist in the modern sense. He is an imperial Australian, convinced that Australia's security and prosperity are tied to the British world. Yet he is also determined that Australia should be taken seriously inside that world. He travels, negotiates, attends imperial conferences, and speaks with the confidence of a man who believes Australia is not a distant outpost, but a partner, junior perhaps, but indispensable. He wants preferential trade, better access for Australian exports, and a stronger voice in imperial policy. At home, he sells his program as progress with discipline. He talks about efficiency in government, about cutting waste, about building infrastructure that will pay for itself in growth. He is not trying to be loved. He is trying to be believed. The 1925 election becomes his first real test in front of the nation. Bruce campaigns on development and stability, and he wins. It's a mandate, but not a blank check. The coalition survives because it must, not because it's harmonious. Page remains treasurer, and the Country Party remains alert, ready to bite if the city men forget who keeps the export economy alive. With the election behind him, Bruce accelerates. He pushes for large-scale migration, believing population is destiny. He wants British migrants to fill farms, factories, and suburbs, to make Australia bigger, richer, and harder to threaten. He promotes schemes to attract settlers and workers, and he frames it as a national project. Australia must grow or be left behind. In his mind, the continent is underused, almost scandalously empty. The future belongs to nations that can mobilize people and capital. But every migrant needs a job, a house, a wage. And wages are not just economics in Australia. They are politics, identity, and conflict. The arbitration system, with its courts and awards, is a pillar of Australian industrial life. Employers complain it makes labor too expensive and inflexible. Unions defend it as civilization itself, a guarantee that workers won't be ground down in a race to the bottom. Bruce, the planner, looks at the system and sees friction. Too many strikes, too much uncertainty, too much power in the hands of militant unions. He wants industrial peace, but his definition of peace sounds to labor like surrender. The tension rises because Bruce is not merely managing the economy, he is trying to rewire it. He believes Australia must become more competitive, more productive, more attractive to investment. That means confronting industrial relations. And confronting industrial relations in 1920s Australia is like walking into a room full of petrol fumes with a match in your pocket. In 1926, Bruce steps onto the world stage at the Imperial Conference in London. The British Empire is changing shape. The Dominions, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, the Irish Free State, are no longer content to be treated as subordinate. The conference produces the Balfour Declaration of 1926, recognizing the Dominions as autonomous communities within the empire, equal in status. Bruce is part of that moment, part of the slow transformation from empire as command to empire as association. It's a historic shift, but it comes with a paradox. Bruce wants Australia to be more equal within the empire, yet he also wants Australia more tightly integrated economically with Britain. He pushes for imperial trade preference, believing Australian producers should have a privileged place in British markets. He imagines a British world economy that can shield its members from foreign competition and instability. Then in 1927, Bruce makes a move that is both symbolic and practical. The federal parliament relocates from Melbourne to the new capital, Canberra. It's easy to treat this as ceremony. Politicians moving into fresh buildings on a windswept plain. But for Bruce, it's part of the modernizing story. A national government physically separated from the old colonial capitals, operating from a purpose-built seat of power. Canberra is still raw, still unfinished, still mocked by some as a political experiment in the bush. Yet Bruce embraces it as a statement. The Commonwealth is permanent, and it intends to govern like a nation, not a collection of colonies. He keeps pushing development, roads, ports, communications, the kind of infrastructure that doesn't make for romantic speeches, but changes a country's bones. He supports scientific and industrial advancement, believing modern economies are built on expertise, not improvisation. He wants Australia to be efficient, connected, and export strong. But the more he pushes, the more resistance hardens. Unions see a government that talks about efficiency the way a knife talks about sharpness. Labor sees a prime minister who is too close to business, too willing to borrow, too eager to discipline workers. Even within the coalition, there are nerves. Development costs money, and money means debt. Australia's borrowing, much of it from London, ties the nation's future to global finance. As long as prices for wool and wheat hold, the gamble looks smart. If prices fall, the gamble becomes a noose. Bruce's personal style doesn't help him. He is not a natural street fighter. He doesn't radiate the easy warmth that disarms suspicion. He can sound like a headmaster, explaining why the rules are good for you. In a country that prides itself on egalitarian instincts, that tone can be fatal. By 1928, the pressure is building toward a single point: industrial relations. Bruce's government introduces legislation aimed at shifting power away from the federal arbitration system and, crucially, weakening the role of unions in certain disputes. The proposal, known as the Transport Workers Act, and more explosively, the attempt to amend the Commonwealth conciliation and arbitration system, ignites outrage. To Bruce, it's rational reform: reduce strikes, increase efficiency, keep the economy moving. To labor and the union movement, it's an attack on the very mechanism that protects workers from exploitation. The conflict becomes personal, not because Bruce shouts, he rarely does, but because he refuses to back down. He believes the nation's future depends on breaking what he sees as industrial paralysis. He frames it as national interest versus sectional interest. His opponents frame it as class war dressed up as administration. And then the coalition begins to crack in the most dangerous way. Not with a dramatic split, but with a slow, public loss of confidence. Some nationalists fear Bruce is pushing too hard, too fast. Some worry he is handing labor the perfect weapon: the claim that the government is anti-worker. The Country Party watches carefully, calculating how far it can go with Bruce without being dragged into an urban industrial brawl that could poison rural support. Bruce is now fighting on three fronts at once: labor in Parliament, unions in the country, and doubts inside his own ranks. The clock in his body keeps ticking, and the clock in politics is ticking louder. The next election is coming, and the nation is tired of conflict. In 1929, Bruce makes the decision that turns his premiership into a high-wire act with no net. He pushes forward with the Maritime Industries Bill, designed to dismantle key parts of federal arbitration and return industrial regulation to the states. It is a direct challenge to the union movement and a gamble that the public will choose order over militancy. It is also a gamble that his own party will follow him into the fire. They don't. A group of nationalist MPs, led by Billy Hughes, the very man Bruce replaced, turn against him. The irony is savage. The old warhorse, forced out by coalition arithmetic, now returns as a wrecking force. Hughes and his allies cross the floor. The government is defeated on the floor of the House of Representatives, not by Labor alone, but by Bruce's own side. It's one of the most dramatic parliamentary betrayals in Australian political history. A prime minister brought down not by a general election, not by a scandal, but by a revolt inside his own camp over the question of how hard the state should push against organized labor. Bruce has a choice in that moment: retreat, compromise, cling to office by softening the bill. Instead, he chooses escalation. He asks for a dissolution, an election. He will take the fight to the country. He will force Australia to decide: his vision of disciplined development or Labor's promise of protecting workers and using government power differently. The election campaign is brutal. The economy is beginning to darken with the first shadows of what will become the Great Depression. Overseas markets are unstable. Debt looks less like a tool and more like a threat. Workers fear unemployment. Employers fear collapse. Everyone senses that the easy optimism of the 1920s is ending. Bruce campaigns as the man of order and national planning. Labor campaigns as the defender of wages and arbitration, the protector against conservative attacks. And hanging over Bruce is the image of a prime minister who tried to break the arbitration system and got stabbed in the back by his own side. The story writes itself in headlines. A government at war with workers, a leader isolated, a coalition cracking. Then comes the final shock of this act. Bruce doesn't just lose government, he loses his seat. In Flinders, the electorate that first sent him to Parliament, he is defeated by a Labour candidate in a result that feels like a personal verdict as much as a political one. It is rare for an Australian Prime Minister to be thrown out of Parliament entirely. It happens to Bruce, and it happens at the exact moment the world is tipping into economic catastrophe. One day he is Prime Minister, trying to reshape the nation's industrial system. The next he is out, watching from the sidelines as James Scullin forms a Labour government and inherits a storm that will test Australia, its finances, its social cohesion, and its faith in institutions. For Bruce, the fall is not just a loss of office. It is the collapse of a whole method, the belief that rational planning, disciplined borrowing, and administrative reform can outrun political emotion. He had tried to engineer Australia into modernity. Australia answered with a rejection so sharp it cut him out of Parliament. And yet, even in defeat, the story isn't finished with him. Because the skills that made him dangerous at home, his networks, his imperial credibility, his obsession with systems, are about to find a new battlefield. The world is breaking again, and the man who once lay awake in London, listening for bombs, is about to return to the place where empires decide what smaller nations must live with. Only this time, he won't be Prime Minister. He'll be something else, something that can shape history without ever winning an election. If you want to understand Stanley Bruce's strangest power, picture this. A man the voters just threw out of Parliament, humiliated, discarded, walking back into the center of the British world as if the ballot box never happened. In Australia, he's the Prime Minister who lost his seat. In London, he's suddenly the man people take aside in corridors, the one who can get a meeting, the one who speaks the language of finance and empire like it's his first tongue, and the clock is already running on him again because the world economy is beginning to fail in slow motion, like a ship taking on water so quietly that the passengers keep dancing. Bruce doesn't vanish after 1929. He regroups. He returns to Parliament in 1931, winning Flinders back at the very moment Australian politics is tearing itself apart under the weight of the Depression. The country is in pain. Unemployment surges, businesses fold, families line up for relief, and the old optimism of the 1920s is replaced by a hard, metallic fear. Governments everywhere are being forced into choices that feel like moral injuries. Cut spending or watch credit collapse. Protect wages or watch exports die. Borrow more or admit you can't. In this atmosphere, Bruce's old obsession, systems, discipline, coordination, stops looking like cold technocracy and starts looking like a survival instinct. He returns not as Prime Minister, but as a senior figure in Joseph Lyons' new United Australia Party government. Lyons is the public face, genial, reassuring, a man who can speak to ordinary Australians without sounding like he's reading a balance sheet. Bruce is something else, a strategist, an internationalist, a believer that Australia's fate is still tied to decisions made far beyond its shores. He becomes assistant treasurer and then, crucially, a minister who can be sent overseas with authority. And overseas is where the real fight is now, because the Depression isn't just an economic event. It's a political infection. It breeds extremism, resentment, and the kind of desperation that makes dictators look like solutions. Bruce's great theme in the 1930s is that Australia cannot afford to be provincial. He pushes for trade access, for financial credibility, for a place at the table where the rules of the global economy are being rewritten. He understands something that is easy to miss if you only watch domestic politics. Australia's prosperity is not produced solely in Australian paddocks and factories. It is priced in London, shipped through global markets, insured by international confidence. When that confidence collapses, a country at the end of the world feels it like a punch to the ribs. So Bruce goes where the decisions are. In 1932, he attends the Imperial Economic Conference at Ottawa, part of a desperate attempt to stitch together an imperial trading system, preferential tariffs, managed access, a kind of economic lifeboat for Britain and the Dominions. The idea is simple and seductive. If the world is closing its doors, the British world should keep its doors open to itself. Bruce is one of the loudest advocates of this logic. He wants Australian exports, especially primary products, to have a protected path into British markets. He wants stability, predictability, a framework that can outlast panic. But here's the twist. The very imperial system he leans on is also weakening. Britain is struggling. Its own industries are under pressure. Its politics are fracturing. And the dominions are no longer obedient satellites. They are increasingly self-interested nations. Bruce is trying to build a coordinated economic machine out of parts that are all starting to pull in different directions. He can negotiate, he can persuade, he can draft elegant agreements, but he cannot force unity where fear is making everyone selfish. Still, his reputation grows. He is seen as a man who can speak for Australia without sounding parochial, who can argue for national interest without sounding like a nationalist. That distinction matters in the 1930s, when nationalism is becoming a weapon. Bruce is not blind to the new dangers. He watches Europe harden. He watches Japan expand. He watches the League of Nations, supposedly the world's referee, prove again and again that it can blow a whistle, but it can't stop a fist. And then, in 1933, Bruce is sent to London as Australia's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. It's a role that looks ceremonial to outsiders. Dinners, cables, speeches. But in the 1930s, it is a frontline posting. London is still the hub of Australia's finance and diplomacy. It is where loans are negotiated, where trade is argued, where strategic assumptions are formed. Bruce arrives with a clear mission: protect Australia's economic lifelines and make sure Australia is heard as the world slides toward another war. He throws himself into the job with the same intensity he once poured into domestic development. He cultivates relationships across British politics and administration. He becomes a familiar figure in the machinery of imperial decision-making. And he begins to push, relentlessly, for something that sounds almost boring, but is actually life or death: coordinated international economic management. He believes the Depression is not just a slump, it is a systemic failure. If nations keep acting alone, raising tariffs, devaluing currencies, hoarding gold, then the world will stay sick, and sick societies will keep producing violent politics. This is where Bruce's story becomes unexpectedly modern. He starts arguing for international institutions with real capacity, bodies that can gather data, coordinate policy, and prevent economic chaos from turning into political catastrophe. He is, in effect, trying to build guardrails for a world that is accelerating toward a cliff. But the cliff is closer than he wants to admit. In the mid-1930s, the headlines are a drumbeat: Italy and Ethiopia, Germany rearming, the Spanish Civil War, Japan and China. The League of Nations looks increasingly like a theater where speeches are performed while armies move. Bruce, stationed in London, watches Britain's strategic confusion up close. He sees the temptation of appeasement, the hope that concessions can buy peace. He also sees the brutal arithmetic. Britain is not ready for war, not psychologically, not economically, not militarily. And Australia, dependent on Britain for security, is tied to that readiness, whether it likes it or not. Bruce's own position is complicated. He is not a warmonger. He is not eager for confrontation. But he is also not naive about what happens when aggressors learn that the world will not stop them. He pushes for stronger collective security, for clearer commitments, for a recognition that the Pacific is not a distant sideshow. Australia's vulnerability is not theoretical. It is geographic. It is the fact of a vast coastline and a small population. The very emptiness Bruce once tried to fill with migrants. Then war comes anyway. In 1939, Europe ignites again. Britain declares war on Germany, and Australia follows. Bruce is in London, and suddenly his job is no longer about trade preferences and loan terms. It's about survival, coordination, and influence in a war cabinet world where decisions are made fast and often in secrecy. He becomes one of the key Australian voices in Britain, a channel between Canberra and Whitehall at a time when cables can carry panic as easily as information. And now the time limit tightens in a new way. Not the slow ticking of economic recovery, but the brutal countdown of military events. In 1940 and 1941, Britain is under direct threat. The Blitz turns London into a city of fire and rubble. Nights are punctured by sirens, by the thud of bombs, by the eerie glow of burning streets. Bruce has lived through war once, but this is different. This is the home of the empire itself being hit, the center shaking. The visual is almost obscene in its symbolism. An imperial capital blacked out, windows taped, people sleeping in underground stations, while the sky tries to kill them. In this chaos, Bruce's value is his access and his steadiness. He can get into rooms, he can speak to ministers, he can argue Australia's case when Australia is not physically present. And Australia's case is becoming desperate, because the war is no longer only in Europe. Japan is moving, the Pacific is tightening like a noose. When Japan attacks in December 1941, the strategic map flips in a single day. Singapore, Britain's supposed fortress in the east, will fall. The myth of British invincibility in Asia collapses with it. For Australians, it is a psychological earthquake. The shield they assumed would hold is suddenly full of holes. Bruce in London is positioned at the heart of the old system, just as that system is failing in the region that matters most to his country. This is the real conflict of his later career. Bruce versus the limits of empire. He has spent his life believing Australia's security and prosperity are anchored in the British world. Now he is forced to watch that anchor drag. He must argue for Australian needs: ships, aircraft, attention, strategic priority, while Britain is fighting for its own life. It is not malice that sidelines Australia, it is triage. And triage is cold. Bruce works through the machinery of wartime coordination, including the complex relationships among Britain, the Dominions, and the United States. He understands that Australia's future security will increasingly depend on American power in the Pacific. That is a profound shift. It means the old imperial framework is no longer enough. It means Australia must learn to operate in a world where Britain is a partner, not a protector. And then, as the war grinds on, Bruce's focus returns to the question that has haunted him since the Depression began. What kind of world will exist after the shooting stops? Because he has seen what happens when peace is followed by economic chaos and political bitterness. He has seen how quickly normal life can rot into extremism. He becomes a strong advocate for post-war planning, international cooperation not as idealism, but as insurance. This is where his influence becomes quietly enormous. Bruce is involved in the push for global economic and social institutions that can prevent a repeat of the 1930s. He supports the idea that food security, employment, and development are not just domestic issues. They are international stability issues. Hungry countries do not stay calm. Unemployed masses do not stay moderate. He wants structures that can measure, coordinate, and respond. By the time the war ends in 1945, Bruce has spent more than a decade embedded in the highest levels of British and international policy circles. He is no longer the Australian Prime Minister who tried to reform arbitration and got destroyed for it. He is an elder statesman of systems, an architect of frameworks, a man who believes that if you can build the right institutions, you can restrain the worst impulses of nations. But there's another twist, and it's personal. Bruce's power now is real, but it is also indirect. He is shaping the world through committees, conferences, drafts, and negotiations, through the slow, grinding work of governance without applause. The public rarely sees it. There are no election night victories, no cheering crowds. There is only the pressure of being in the room when history is being written, and knowing that a poorly chosen sentence in an agreement can cost lives later. He stays in London through the war years and beyond, continuing as High Commissioner until 1945. And even after that formal role ends, he does not retire into silence. He moves deeper into international work, especially around food and agriculture, because he has come to believe that the next global crisis will not begin with tanks, but with scarcity. The man who once tried to modernize Australia with men, money, and markets is now trying to modernize the world's survival instincts. He is still fighting the same enemy in a new form: disorder, economic, political, human. And the most unsettling part is that he is fighting it with the same tools that once made Australians distrust him: planning, coordination, discipline. Only now the stakes are not an election. They are whether the post-war world will learn anything at all. If you want the final image of Stanley Bruce to make sense, don't picture a retired prime minister in a quiet garden. Picture a man in London, older now, moving through corridors where the air still tastes faintly of smoke and rationing, trying to stop the next catastrophe before anyone can even see it coming. The war's over, the guns have cooled, and the world is already doing that dangerous thing it always does after a victory: relaxing, forgetting, spending peace like it's an endless credit line. Bruce can't afford that kind of amnesia, because he's seen what comes after. He watched the 1920s optimism curdle into the Depression. He watched economic panic feed political monsters. And now, in the late 1940s, he's convinced the next disaster won't announce itself with marching boots. It will arrive quietly through empty granaries, collapsing commodity prices, and governments that can't feed their people. Hunger, he believes, is the fuse, and the fuse is already lit. So when his formal term as Australia's High Commissioner in London ends in 1945, he doesn't come home in the way people expect. Australia has changed while he's been away. Its strategic center of gravity pulled toward the United States, its politics reshaped. By wartime mobilization and a new Labour government under John Curtin and then Ben Chifley, Bruce, the old conservative modernizer, is no longer the man of the hour in Canberra. But in the new world of international institutions, where the future is being negotiated line by line, he is suddenly in his element again. He throws his weight behind the United Nations system, but not in the starry-eyed way critics like to mock. For Bruce, international cooperation is not a moral accessory. It's a piece of engineering, a dam against floods he knows are coming. And the project he latches onto with almost obsessive focus is food. The shock is how literal it is. Europe is shattered. Cities are broken teeth. Railways are twisted. Farms are mined, burned, stripped of labor. In parts of Asia, the war has left famine and displacement like a second occupation. Millions are on the edge of starvation, and the numbers are so large they stop sounding human until you picture the actual scene. A child with a tin bowl, a mother trading a wedding ring for flour, a line of people that doesn't end at the corner because it doesn't end at all. Bruce becomes one of the most forceful advocates for a global body that can treat food as security. Not charity, security. He works closely with the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, which has been founded in 1945 with the ambition of raising nutrition, improving agricultural productivity, and stabilizing rural economies. It sounds technical, it is, and that's exactly why Bruce believes it matters. Because the next war, he thinks, will be born in the gap between population and supply, between expectations and reality. In 1946, he is elected the first chairman of the FAO Council. It's a role without the glamour of a prime ministership, but it comes with a different kind of pressure, the pressure of being responsible for systems that must work across borders, ideologies, and resentments still raw from war. The Cold War is beginning to harden. Suspicion is becoming policy, and Bruce is trying to persuade governments to share data, coordinate production, and plan distribution at the exact moment when secrecy and national self-interest are becoming reflexes. Here the old conflict returns in a new costume. Bruce versus the limits of power. He can argue, draft, cajole, and warn. He can build committees and frameworks, but he cannot command sovereign states. He is trying to make the world behave rationally while it is reorganizing itself around fear. And then comes the time limit, his most personal one. Bruce is in his 60s now, then his 70s. The pace of travel, the endless meetings, the strain of negotiation, it all costs more than it used to. He doesn't say it dramatically, but the urgency is there in everything he does. He acts like a man who knows he is racing his own body. The clock is not a metaphor anymore. It's the calendar, the fatigue in the bones, the knowledge that if he doesn't get these structures built now, someone else will inherit a half-finished machine when the next crisis hits. He pushes for what becomes known as the World Food Board concept, an idea to stabilize food supplies and prices internationally, to prevent the boom and bust cycles that can ruin farmers one year and starve cities the next. The logic is brutally simple. If you let food markets swing wildly, you don't just create economic pain, you create political extremism. Bruce wants buffer stocks, coordinated purchasing, long-term planning. He wants the world to treat wheat and rice the way it treats ammunition, as strategic material. But the unexpected twist is that the very countries with the most capacity to make it happen, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, are wary. They fear costs, loss of control, domestic backlash. They fear being locked into obligations. Bruce runs into the same wall he hit in Australia decades earlier. People like the benefits of coordination, but they hate the feeling of being coordinated. He doesn't win everything he wants. The World Food Board, as he imagines it, never fully materializes. Yet the fight itself leaves fingerprints. The FAO grows into a permanent part of the post-war architecture. The idea that nutrition, agriculture, and rural development are global stability issues becomes harder to dismiss. Bruce's influence is often invisible in the final headlines, but it's there in the way the conversation shifts, from aid as a temporary gesture to food policy as a permanent responsibility. And while he is doing this, his personal life remains almost eerily spare. Bruce has no children. His marriage to Ethel is long and loyal, a partnership that survives distance and public storms. But their world is not the noisy world of a big family. It is a world of letters, schedules, obligations, and the quiet intimacy of two people who have lived inside history's machinery for too long to be impressed by it. Ethel is his constant, and when she dies in 1967, it will hit like the removal of a load-bearing wall. Bruce's relationship with Australia, meanwhile, becomes something like a long-distance argument that never quite ends. He is honored, yes. He is made a Viscount in 1947, becoming Viscount Bruce of Melbourne, a title that signals how fully his life has shifted into the British and international sphere. To some Australians, it confirms an old suspicion, that he was always more imperial than national, more London than Melbourne. To others, it is recognition that an Australian helped design the post-war world. He returns to Australia only occasionally. When he does, he is treated with respect, but not with the heat reserved for political warriors who stayed and bled in domestic battles. Bruce's battlefield has become abstract to most voters. Institutions, councils, frameworks. The kind of work that prevents disasters is always harder to celebrate than the kind that wins elections. Yet his legacy keeps accumulating in quiet ways. The migration and development push of his prime ministership helped set patterns that later governments expanded. His insistence on national planning, so controversial in the 1920s, looks less alien in a post-war era of big government and reconstruction. His belief that Australia must think internationally becomes, over time, almost a cliché of Australian foreign policy. And his post-war work helps embed the idea that security is not only military, that it is also economic, social, and agricultural. There is another turn, late in his life, that feels almost poetic. The man who once tried to bind Australia tighter to the British world ends up living long enough to see that world dissolve into something else. The empire becomes a commonwealth of independent nations. Britain's global dominance fades. The United States and the Soviet Union define the new order. The old imperial center that once seemed permanent becomes just another power navigating decline. Bruce doesn't rage against it. He adapts, as he always did, but you can sense the tension. His life's assumptions are being revised by history itself. The anchor he trusted has moved. The system he served has transformed. And yet, in a strange way, this vindicates his deepest instinct, that nations must build structures bigger than themselves because no single country, not even an empire, stays strong forever. In his final years, he remains in Britain, increasingly frail, still engaged, still reading, still thinking in terms of systems. The public image of him is dignified, almost austere. But if you trace the line through his life, the emotional core is not coldness. It's fear, disciplined fear, fear of waste, fear of chaos, fear of societies collapsing into anger. He spent his life trying to replace improvisation with design. On 25 August 1967, Stanley Bruce dies in London, aged 84. Weeks earlier, Ethel has died too. The timing feels cruel, as if the story insists on closing its last door quickly. He is cremated, and his ashes are later taken back to Australia to be placed in Melbourne General Cemetery, an ending that finally returns him to the country he tried to reshape, even if he spent so much of his later life elsewhere. And that's the final contrast that makes his biography linger. Stanley Bruce was a prime minister who lost his seat, a leader rejected, at the ballot box. Yet he helped build parts of the post-war world that outlasted the governments that defeated him. He chased men, money, and markets in the 1920s, and ended up chasing food security and international coordination in the 1940s and 1950s. He fought unions, then fought hunger. He tried to modernize a young nation, then tried to stabilize a wounded planet. His story doesn't end with a triumphant crowd. It ends with paperwork, councils, and the stubborn belief that if you can keep people fed, employed, and connected to a functioning system, you can keep them from reaching for the worst alternatives. Because Bruce understood something terrifyingly simple. Civilization is not a permanent condition. It's a supply chain.